Daniel Murphy was 92 years old when he pulled his rusted 1987 stock trailer into the parking lot of the Will Rogers Memorial Coliseum in Fort Worth, Texas. The trailer had faded red paint and a tailgate that required a specific combination of lifting and kicking to open properly. Daniel had been meaning to fix it for about 15 years now, but never got around to it. The other competitors were already warming up their horses in the practice arena. Daniel watched them through his windshield as he finished his coffee from the thermos he'd filled that morning in Stephenville. The riders were young. Most of them were in their 30s and 40s, the prime years for a cutting horse trainer. A few were in their 50s, considered veterans of the sport. The oldest competitor Daniel had seen so far looked to be about 60, and people were already commenting on how remarkable it was that he was still competing at his age. Daniel was 92. He'd been riding horses since before most of these competitors' grandparents were born. He climbed out of his truck slowly, the way he did everything these days. His knees had been replaced twice, his right hip once, and his back was held together by what his doctor called stubbornness, and what Daniel called prayer. His hands ached in the morning until he worked them loose, the knuckles swollen with arthritis that had been building for 40 years. His hair and mustache had gone the color of wood smoke, and his face carried 92 years of Texas weather in every line and crease. The National Cutting Horse Association Futurity was the biggest competition in the sport. Horses had to be exactly 4 years old to compete, and the training programs that produced them were measured in millions of dollars. The riders who competed here had teams of assistants, veterinarians, nutritionists, and coaches. They had sponsors and investors and breeding operations that had been preparing horses for this single event for generations. Daniel had none of that. He had a small ranch outside of Stephenville with 47 acres of scrub oak and memories. He had a Social Security check that barely covered his property taxes. He had a granddaughter who worried about him constantly, and a doctor who had stopped trying to tell him what he couldn't do because Daniel never listened anyway. And he had Daisy. He walked to the back of his trailer and performed the specific combination of lifting and kicking that made the tailgate cooperate. Inside, a sorrel mare stood quietly, her copper coat catching the morning light. She had a white blaze running down her face like a lightning strike frozen in time, and eyes that tracked Daniel's every movement with calm intelligence. Daisy was 4 years old. 3 years ago, she had been headed for Slaughter, a skinny, scared horse at a kill pen auction in Oklahoma, with no papers and no history. Daniel had paid $800 for her, which was about $750 more than he could afford at the time. His family thought he'd lost his mind. His doctor said he had no business breaking a young horse at 89 years old. But Daniel had seen something in her eyes that day, a spark, a question. He'd been around horses for nearly 9 decades, and he knew, the way you know your own heartbeat, that this mare was different. Now she was here, at the biggest cutting horse competition in the world, about to compete against horses worth more than Daniel's entire ranch. The purse was over $1 million. The youngest competitor was 28. The average age was 43. Nobody in the history of the event had ever competed at Daniel's age, not even close. A young trainer walked past Daniel's trailer, glanced at Daisy, then did a double-take when he saw Daniel's face. The young man's expression shifted through several emotions: confusion, disbelief, something that might have been pity. He whispered something to his colleague, and they both stared. Daniel had seen that look before. He'd been seeing it for years now, every time he showed up somewhere that people thought he was too old to be. The look said that he was a joke, a sentimental story, a dying man who didn't know when to quit. What the look didn't understand was that Daniel Murphy had been underestimated his entire life, and he'd spent 92 years proving people wrong. To understand what Daniel Murphy was attempting, you need to understand what cutting is, and why a 92-year-old man competing at this level borders on impossible. Cutting began in the 1800s, when cowboys needed to separate individual cattle from a herd for branding, doctoring, or sale. The best horses could read a cow's mind, mirror its every move, and hold it away from the herd without any guidance from the rider. It required athleticism, intelligence, and an almost supernatural connection between horse and human. The rider's job was to pick the cow and then stay out of the horse's way, trusting the animal completely while maintaining perfect balance through movements that could snap a spine if you weren't prepared. The modern cutting horse competition had evolved into one of the most demanding events in the equestrian world. The National Cutting Horse Association Futurity was the Super Bowl of the sport, held every December in Fort Worth. Horses had to be exactly 4 years old, which meant trainers had a narrow window to prepare them. The training programs were intense, the competition fierce, and the money involved was staggering. The horses that competed at the Futurity were worth anywhere from $100,000 to several $1 million. They were bred for generations specifically for this moment, their bloodlines tracked and analyzed like racehorses. The trainers who worked with them were full-time professionals who did nothing but prepare cutting horses, with staffs of assistants and access to unlimited cattle for practice. Daniel Murphy had none of this. He had 47 acres, a handful of borrowed cattle, and a mare that had cost him $800 at a kill-pen auction. The story of how Daniel found Daisy had become something of a local legend around Stephenville. He'd driven 4 hours to that auction in Oklahoma on a hunch, the kind of feeling he'd learned to trust over 8 decades of working with horses. The kill pen was a depressing place, full of horses that had run out of luck and were headed for slaughter unless someone intervened. Most of them were old, broken down, or so poorly bred that nobody wanted them. Daisy had been standing in the corner of the pen, skinny and scared, her coat dull with neglect. She had no papers, no history, no brand, just another throwaway horse in a world that discarded them by the thousands. But Daniel had seen the way she moved. Even half-starved, even terrified, there was something in her carriage that spoke of quality. And when he walked up to the fence, she had looked at him with an expression he recognized, the expression of a horse that was waiting for someone to believe in her. He'd paid $800, which cleaned out his savings account. His granddaughter, Sarah, had driven out from Dallas the next weekend to yell at him about it. She was worried about his health, his finances, his judgment. She thought he was throwing money away on a horse he was too old to train. Daniel had listened patiently, the way he always did when people told him what he couldn't do. Then he had walked Sarah out to the pasture and introduced her to Daisy. "Watch her eyes," Daniel had said. "See how she's tracking that mockingbird? See how she moves her feet? This mare's got cow in her blood. Somebody spent good money breeding her, and somebody else threw her away. I aim to find out what she can do." The training took 3 years. Daniel couldn't do the young man's work anymore. He couldn't climb on and off a dozen times a day, couldn't ride out the big bucks, couldn't spend 12 hours in the saddle the way he had in his 20s. So he adapted. He spent the first 6 months just building trust, grooming Daisy every day, talking to her, teaching her that hands could be gentle and humans could be safe. When he finally climbed on her back for the first time, she had stood still as a stone, like she'd been waiting for him, like she understood. The real training started slowly. Daniel couldn't afford his own cattle, so he made deals with neighbors. He'd help them work their stock if they'd let him use a few head to practice on. It was old-fashioned, the way ranchers had done things for 100 years before the big-money training operations took over the sport. Word got around Stephenville about the old man and the kill pen mare. People would drive out to watch, expecting to see comedy. They left shaking their heads, unable to believe what they'd witnessed. Because Daisy wasn't just learning, she was transforming. Something in her breeding, some distant echo of championship bloodlines that nobody knew about, was waking up. By the 2nd year, she was reading cattle like a fortune teller reads cards. By the 3rd year, she was doing things Daniel had only seen a handful of horses do in his entire life. His granddaughter Sarah had filmed one of their practice sessions and posted it online. She thought her friends might find it interesting, the old cowboy and his rescue horse working cattle in the Texas heat. Within a week, the video had 2 million views. Within 2 weeks, the Futurity organizers had reached out. They wanted Daniel to enter. They thought it would be good publicity, a human interest story. The oldest competitor in history, the kill pen mare, the feel-good narrative that sports organizations loved. They probably expected him to finish last, to wave at the crowd. to provide a heartwarming moment before the real competitors took the stage. Daniel didn't say yes for the publicity. He said yes because he knew the truth that no one else could see yet. Daisy was ready, and so was he. The morning of the competition, Daniel woke at 4 a.m. in his trailer, the same time he'd been waking for 70 years. Some habits didn't change just because you were old. He made coffee in a dented percolator that had belonged to his wife, and he read a passage from the Bible she had given him 40 years ago. Penny had been gone for 12 years now, but Daniel still read to her every morning. He figured she could hear him from wherever she was. By 5, he was brushing Daisy. She didn't need it. He'd brushed her the night before and she'd been blanketed in a clean stall. But the routine calmed them both. And Daniel had learned a long time ago that competitions were won in the quiet moments before the crowd arrived. "Big day," he said to her, running the brush along her copper neck. "Lot of people out there think we're a joke. What do you say we show them different?" Daisy turned her head and nudged his chest, the way she always did when she wanted him to know she was listening. The preliminary rounds began at 8. There were 173 horses entered, and the competition would take 3 days. Daniel and Daisy were scheduled for the second day, late afternoon. That gave him time to watch, to study, to understand what they were up against. He spent the first day in the stands, a notebook in his lap, observing every run with the same focus he'd brought to horses his entire life. The competitors were magnificent. $1-million horses with training programs that cost more per month than Daniel's ranch was worth. Riders who'd won championships, who appeared in magazines, who had sponsorship deals with companies that sold everything from trucks to supplements. They were good. Daniel had to admit that. Some of them were very good. But as he watched run after run, he started to notice something. The expensive horses were precise, athletic, perfectly trained. But there was a mechanical quality to some of them, a sense that they were performing rather than feeling. The riders guided them, cued them, managed every movement with technical perfection. Daniel's approach was different. He didn't guide Daisy, he trusted her. There was a difference, one that most people never understood. The second day arrived with a cold front moving through Fort Worth. Daniel wore his heaviest jacket as he warmed Daisy up in the practice arena, working her slowly through the movements she'd need. His joints ached in the cold, his back stiff from sleeping in the trailer, but once he was in the saddle, all of that faded away. It always did. The professional trainers watched Daisy during warm-ups. A few of them got quiet as they observed her move. They saw how she tracked the practice cattle with predator focus, how she anticipated their movements before they made them. They stopped smirking. The afternoon came. Daniel's name was called. He rode Daisy into the arena, and the crowd noise shifted. There was recognition, phones being raised, people elbowing each other and pointing. The old cowboy and his rescue mare. They'd heard the story. They wanted to see if it was real. Daniel settled into the herd. 30 head of cattle milled around him, each one a puzzle waiting to be solved. He had 2.5 minutes to show what Daisy could do. 2.5 minutes to prove that heart could beat money, that patience could beat pedigree, that 92 years of experience meant something in a sport that worshipped youth. He took a breath, felt Daisy coil beneath him like a spring, scanned the herd and picked out a cow, a quick, crafty Brangus with something to prove. And then he dropped his hand. Daisy exploded into motion. The next 2.5 minutes became the most watched cutting horse video in the history of the sport, though Daniel didn't know that yet. All he knew was the feeling, the sensation of being completely connected to another living creature, of moving as one being through space and time. Daisy mirrored the Brangus step for step. The cow cut left, and Daisy was there before it finished the thought. It burst right, and she matched it like a shadow. Her movements were so quick, so precise, that the crowd started making sounds nobody had planned to make. Gasps, shouts, involuntary exclamations from people who thought they'd seen everything the sport had to offer. Daniel sat perfectly still. That was the mark of a true cutting horse rider. The less you did, the more you were doing. His hands stayed down. His reins stayed loose. He trusted Daisy completely, the way he'd trusted her for 3 years, letting her read the cow, letting her make the decisions. The Brangus tried everything. Quick cuts, explosive bursts, freezing, then bolting. Nothing worked. Daisy was there before the cow knew where it wanted to go. She was reading its mind, answering questions it hadn't asked yet. 30 seconds in, Daniel quit the first cow and cut a new one. This was strategy. He needed to show the judges that Daisy could handle different challenges, different cattle personalities. The second cow was lazy, dull, the kind of animal that could make a horse look bad because there was nothing to work with. But Daisy made it look like a difficult opponent anyway, working it with flashy moves that showcased her athletic ability. 1 minute in. The crowd was fully engaged now. People who had come to watch a heartwarming sideshow were witnessing something else entirely. Daniel cut a third cow, the most dangerous choice, a hot-tempered red heifer that immediately tried to charge back to the herd. This was where lesser horses failed. This was where training showed. This was where heart either rose or broke. Daisy dropped her head, pinned her ears, and went to war. For 90 seconds, she and that heifer battled. It was beautiful and brutal at the same time, a dance and a fight conducted in movements too fast for the untrained eye to follow. Daisy's muscles rippled under her copper coat, sweat foamed on her neck. But she never gave ground, never let the heifer win. Daniel felt every moment of it, through his seat bones, through his legs, through the connection he'd built with this mare over 3 years of patient work. He was 92 years old, his body failing in ways he didn't like to think about. But right now, in this moment, he felt 25 again. He felt like he could do this forever. The horn sounded. Time expired. Daniel straightened up, patted Daisy's neck, and rode out of the arena. The crowd erupted. People were standing, cheering, some of them crying. The noise was so loud Daniel could feel it in his chest, a physical pressure that threatened to knock him sideways. Daisy's ears flicked back and forth, uncertain what to make of all the chaos. Daniel leaned forward and spoke softly to her, the same way he always did. "That's for you, girl. They're cheering for you." Then the score came up on the board. 224 points. The arena went silent for a split second as people processed what they'd seen. Then the noise came back twice as loud as before. 224. It wasn't just the highest score of the day. It was the highest score of the entire competition so far. It was one of the highest scores in futurity history. A kill-pen mare and a 92-year-old cowboy had just put up a number that would have been remarkable for a $1 million horse and a champion trainer. Daniel returned to his trailer area, moving through a crowd of people who wanted to shake his hand, take his picture, ask him questions he didn't have time to answer. He needed to take care of Daisy first. That was always the priority. He unsaddled her slowly, cooled her down with the same patience he'd shown in training, gave her extra grain and fresh water. His hands were shaking, not from nerves but from the arthritis that flared up when he overdid it. He was exhausted. The 2.5 minutes had taken everything out of him. He sat in his fold-out chair outside the trailer and waited. An hour passed. 2 hours. The scores kept coming in on the app his granddaughter had installed on his phone. Some were good, some were great. But none of them touched 224. Then, Cole Winters rode. Metallic Storm was everything a cutting horse should be. $2 million of perfect breeding, trained by a team of professionals for 4 years. Cole was a master, his body English subtle and precise, his timing impeccable. He'd won this competition 3 times. He knew exactly what he was doing. The run was spectacular. Even Daniel, watching on the small screen of his phone, could see that it was one of the best performances Winters had ever given. The crowd cheered with recognition. The judges conferred. The score came up. 223, 1 point short. Daniel stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he looked over at Daisy, who was eating her grain with the calm satisfaction of a horse that had done good work and knew it. 1 point, Daniel said to her. 1 point. There were still 20 horses left to go. Daniel watched each run with quiet focus, his heart rate elevated in ways his doctor would not have approved of. 218, 214, 221, 219. Good scores, great scores, but no one touched 224. When the final horn sounded and the final score posted, Daniel Murphy became the oldest competitor to ever win the National Cutting Horse Association Futurity. And Daisy, the Kilpen mare that nobody wanted, became a champion. The award ceremony was held that evening under the lights of the Will Rogers Coliseum. Daniel stood in the arena with Daisy, surrounded by cameras and reporters and people who wanted to be part of a moment that had already gone viral. The check they presented was oversized, cartoonishly big, $1 million made out to Daniel Murphy of Stephenville, Texas. The ceremony felt like a dream, the kind you have when you're very tired and not quite sure what's real. Daniel answered questions automatically, the same responses he'd been giving all day, while part of his mind stayed focused on Daisy, making sure she wasn't getting stressed by all the attention. "How does it feel?" a reporter asked. "Feels like hard work paid off. Feels like the good Lord had a plan. What will you do with the money?" Daniel had thought about this during the long hours of waiting for scores. "Pay off my ranch, set some aside for my grandkids, donate a good portion to horse rescue organizations. Too many good horses end up where Daisy was headed. Figure I can help change that." "Will you retire now?" Daniel almost smiled at that one. Almost. Retire from what? "I'm a cowboy. Cowboys don't retire. We just slow down a little." Later, after the ceremony ended and the crowd thinned out, Daniel led Daisy back to the old stock trailer. A reporter asked if he'd upgrade now that he was a millionaire. "This trailer's got another 100,000 miles in it," Daniel said. "So do I." He loaded Daisy, performed a specific combination of lifting and kicking that made the tailgate close properly, and climbed slowly into the driver's seat. The engine turned over on the third try, same as always. Some things didn't change just because you had money in the bank. The drive back to Stephenville took 2 hours. Daniel made one stop at a small diner outside of Granbury, a place he'd been going for 40 years. He ordered coffee and chicken fried steak, same as always. The waitress, a woman named Dolores who'd known Daniel since she was a teenager, had seen the news. "Danny Murphy," she said, setting down his coffee. $1 million. I never thought I'd see the day. Makes 2 of us, Dolores. What's it feel like? Daniel considered the question, really thought about it for the first time since the score had posted. "Feels like I kept a promise," he said finally. "That mare came to me when nobody else wanted her. I told her I'd show her what she could be. Today she found out." Dolores squeezed his shoulder and left him to his meal. Daniel ate slowly, watching the trucks go by on the highway, thinking about the long, strange path that had brought him here. 92 years of life. 75 years of working with horses. A wife he still missed every day, children who'd grown up and grandchildren who worried about him. And now this, $1 million and a championship that nobody had expected. The money would change some things. He could fix the barn roof that had been leaking for 5 years. He could buy better hay, replace the ancient tractor that broke down every other week. He could set aside enough to make sure Sarah and her kids were taken care of after he was gone. But the money wouldn't change the important things. He'd still wake at 4 a.m. every morning. He'd still read from Penny's Bible. He'd still walk out to the pasture and brush Daisy, talking to her about the day ahead. By the time Daniel got home, it was dark. He unloaded Daisy and turned her out in the pasture, watching her roll in the dirt and shake off the dust like any other horse after a long trip. The championship trophy and the giant check were in his truck, but those were just objects. The real victory was standing in front of him, a copper mare with a white blaze, eating grass under the Texas stars. He stood at the fence for a long time, watching her graze, feeling the night air cool against his face. His knees hurt, his back was stiff, his hands ached in the darkness. But none of that mattered, not really. He was still here, he was still riding, he was still doing the thing he'd been born to do. "We showed them, didn't we, girl?" he said quietly. 92 years old and they said we couldn't do it. But we showed them. Daisy raised her head and looked at him, her eyes catching the starlight. She walked over to the fence and pushed her nose against his chest, the same gesture she'd made every day since he brought her home from that Oklahoma kill pen. Daniel stroked her face, feeling the warmth of her breath against his hands. He thought about all the horses he'd known over the years, all the lessons they'd taught him. He thought about Penny and how proud she would have been. He thought about the decades stretching behind him and the unknown amount of time still ahead. "Cowboys don't retire," he said to Daisy, to the stars, to whatever was listening. "We just slow down a little." The mare nudged him again, and Daniel laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet pasture into the Texas night. He had a championship trophy in his truck and $1 million coming to his bank account, but right now, all that mattered was this moment. An old man. A good horse. A life built on patience and trust, and the willingness to believe in things that other people had given up on. That wasn't just his story, that was the whole point. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts on Daniel and Daisy's incredible journey. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories about horses and the unbreakable bonds they form with humans. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our daily uploads. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the greatest victories come when everyone counts you out. Sometimes age is just a number, and heart is the only currency that matters.